and so on. But what's so important about the proslogion? It's a meditation. But what is it a meditation about? It's about the most famous argument in the history of logic, actually. And it's referred to as the ontological argument. Ontos means thing, the definition of a thing in Greek, and logical, what's the implications of the definition? You could argue about that about horses. What's the implications if I say this is a horse? Well, it has four feet, legs. But in this case, and by the way, the term ontological was not used by Anselm. That was a term given by Immanuel Kant much later in his analyses of various argument types, but we call it that. So if you look up Immanuel Kant, A-L, whatever. So notice, and Kant's most important works were in the 1780s. So this is obviously way later when we call it an ontological argument. The ontological argument is the argument from definition. Kant gives the title the teleological argument, the argument from design, telos, purpose, and the cosmological argument, which is the argument from the cosmos. You look at the physical world. But so these are all types of arguments for God. So what is God? And so the first thing is, well, you've got to give the definition. And so what do we mean by God? And Anselm gives us a definition which is actually a kind of an updated version of the one that St. Augustine uses. But this definition is the one that we still use, and theologians today that study theology, no matter what their religion, I think, eventually, if they believe that there is such a thing as a God, what do they mean by it? They tend to all seem to agree on the idea that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And notice that this is in the negative. It's not saying God has wings, God has a beard, God is female. It doesn't say anything about the actual characteristics of whatever it is you're calling by this concept. In a sense, the argument that God exists is often called a vacuous truth. Okay, it's true. It doesn't mean anything though. It's vacuous. So okay, God exists. Has to be. Why? Well, God is a being than which none greater can be conceived. If existence in reality is greater than existence in the mind alone, so if I think of a unicorn, I have a conception of an existing thing in my mind, but guess what? We happen to know there are no unicorns unless you also mean single-horned animals in Africa that are not horses. With we're thinking of the silvery-looking white, with the horn, etc. The real animals are superior to the ones that are just imaginary. It's a value, right? Real things are more important, right? If existence in reality is greater than existence in the mind alone, an imagined being who exists only in our mind is not a being than which none greater can be conceived, because I can conceive of a greater one, that is, a unicorn that actually exists, right? A being than which none greater can be conceived must also exist in reality, where failure to do so would be a failure to be such. In other words, if there isn't that than which nothing greater can be thought in existence, it isn't that than which nothing greater can be thought. But by definition, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. So therefore, that than which nothing greater can be thought must exist, and we call this God. So this is the ontological argument from the definition, God, that than which nothing greater can be conceived or can be thought, etc. You can follow the analysis of this. For an updated version of it, you could look at Kurt Gödel, Ontological Proof. So Gödel was Einstein's friend, and he was also a Platonist, but that's interesting. So he had his own version of it, which you can play with as well. But basically, I would argue that this argument succeeds. But I agree that in a sense it's a vacuous truth. In other words, okay, it's annoying as heck that you have to agree that just by definition, God must exist. Now, notice I'm not saying Jesus or Allah, or I'm not taking sides on any other thing than that by definition God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. My most likely thought is, well, whatever it is that made the universe happen. God bless you. So that's where I go with that. Okay, so I don't know what that is. I can't really describe it and so on. But when we get into arguments about whether or not God exists, it seems logical to me that God has a referent. We just don't know what it is. A referent, when I use the word God, I'm referring to something that is existent. Throughout all time and space, and responsible for everything existing rather than not. But no, I can't actually go beyond that as part of the proof. And yes, you can get into modal logic and all kinds of other fun things to argue about it. My feeling is that mathematicians think, well, of course it works. Kant, in his interesting critique of the various types of arguments, labeling this the ontological argument, argued, well, the main problem with it is the conclusion is grammatically incorrect. Because the conclusion is God exists. And what does that mean? God is. And for Kant, you're saying God is, but you don't say God is what? So precisely the vacuity of this truth, Kant argues, is the failure of the argument, because for you to say something exists, you need to give it specific characteristics so that I could go out and double check and see it. Say, oh yeah, you're right. There is a coin in the museum that was, minted in 321, or whatever. So Kant feels that the argument fails because of a problem of grammar. But since Kant people point out, well, this mug exists, this one doesn't. Existence is a predicate. So it isn't vacuous in the sense that you're saying that God exists doesn't mean anything. It does mean something, at least mathematically.
Is he trying to find physical proof?
Well, that's what Kant is trying to say. Is for Kant, none of these proofs work. The teleological one is that we usually say the argument from design. Look at how absolutely amazing this universe is, how an eye is so perfectly designed for its function and so on. That's not chance. There's a designer, and the designer must be God. Right? So that's the teleological argument. cosmological argument is the argument from looking around and seeing stuff changing. So this happens, and this happens, and this happens. Just like the book Determined, that says every choice you make is actually based on all these prior cause and effect relationships, right? So there's no real free agency on your part. You're just a cog in the machine, basically. Oddly, you're self-reflective, so you're aware of yourself as a cog in a machine. Seems to me. But by the way, when you get into that argument, my favorite contemporary, well, he just died recently, so he has a book called Freedom Evolves. And basically he argues that in an evolutionary universe, what we've got is a constant evolutionary progress associated with intelligence, understanding that it is itself, and understanding that it understands, and then basically having abilities because of that evolving intelligence. And in fact, in a society where we've got lots of machines that enable us to have lots of choices. Just the other day I was in Freddy's, I think it was, and maybe it was a commissary, I shopped in both, and a woman with her 2 children were standing there looking at all the honeys. There's honey, the jars of honey. Sorry, that could have meant something else. They're looking at all the jars of honey, and I, being a weird person, I come along and I look at the kids and I said, honey. And I looked at her and she's still puzzling over, what the trouble is, which one is best? And I said, Malcolm Gladwell called that paralysis of choice. I don't know if you're familiar with Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell, I love his hair. His hair is very, paradox of choice. What? That person has no hair. That's not the right person. Maybe he's talking about Malcolm. Here's Malcolm. Look at that hair. Isn't that something? Should you jump up like that with a belly like that? I don't think so. What is going on here?
I think I was supposed to talk about my new book, which is called Blink, and it's about snap judgments and first impressions. And it comes out in January, and I hope you all buy it in certificates. But I was thinking that when I realized that my
So that's Malcolm Gladwell. He's fascinating, contemporary, out there. Writes the kind of book that makes you. In any case, the paralysis of choice, all these choices. Well, thank you, modern times. Thank you, modern technology. Thank you, ragu. You don't just get one kind of spaghetti sauce. You got 24 varieties of spaghetti sauce, and of course, all these brands, they come up with all these different varieties of things. And, the poor husbands, they go there, I'm supposed to get spaghetti sauce. What the hell am I going to pick? And thank you. We've got the phone. We can call home, and wife tells us, get the one with the label that has the fruit on it. Oh, okay. Husbands are rescued by modern devices, so that they can get the right stuff, etc. This is very important. 52 years of marriage, making the right, choices, very important, and worth it. By the way, just so you know, might not seem that at around the 5th year or 7th year, the itch year. But you know what? Stick it out. I'll tell you, it's well worth it.
I'll get to 5.
But so basically, our society, our technology is evolving how many choices we have. So when it comes to freedom, I would go with Freedom Evolves. And Daniel Dennett had some good discussions before he died with Sapolsky. They're on the web. You can tell he's getting old and almost dying, but nonetheless, they're worth the discussion. Okay, so Anselm gives us an argument, which I hope you get to consider it and think about it. I hope I didn't ruin it for you, actually, by arguing also that it's a vacuous truth. There are other vacuous truths and so on. But nonetheless, and when you get into an argument form, having a vacuous truth as part of the argument, you can't actually deny it, so it implies lots of other things as well, etc. So that's fun. But part of what I wanted to do is not just talk about Anselm and the ontological argument, but to talk about the Middle Ages in general. And so, when we're thinking about the Middle Ages, you've probably also heard them referred to as the Dark Ages, and so on. And certainly they didn't have electricity. What made light? Intelligence. And after the barbarians, who were Romans and Christians, basically overthrew the empire, they did decrease the budget. There was a version of Elon Musk that went in to the monasteries and say, we don't need all this. We don't need to support you with all of this enterprise of keeping these worm-eaten books going. So there was a decrease in a lot of those kinds of things, which eventually would start to come back. There's an interesting argument how the Irish saved civilization. Basically, the monasteries that were the furthest away from the center were the ones that survived the best. And as a result, once things kind of recovered a little bit, they were the ones that influenced back into the heart of the civilization. So that's kind of fun. But we have some specific individuals that I'd like to mention. One of them, for example, is St. Francis, also known as St. Francis of Assisi. There's all kinds of interesting things about him. You could visit Assisi, God bless you, which is a big monastery complex and convent complex and church, and very important tourist site. The town is really very antique-y, French, and all hills. So if you're lame, don't try it.
Did you go?
When I talk about a lot of these places that I have been to, I'm talking about my visit via Google Earth with my Oculus. You can visit all these places. I don't. You can go there. I've been to where Aquinas was in the tower via Google Earth, and I had the picture up. And I remember one student said, "Oh, when we were in grammar school, they took us on a tour there. I remember that door, where it had the sign that says this is where Thomas Aquinas was locked in the tower, etc." Remember, I'm 73. I've traveled, thanks to the Army especially, in lots of places, Berlin. I even entered Juarez one afternoon with a couple of friends, walked the street down and back. I just got to the point where I bought 3 hats for the kids and the poncho kind of thing for my wife, serape, whatever. Yeah. Didn't get in trouble the whole time. No, but that's okay. We were on a long weekend when we were at Fort Machuca in Arizona, and we drove there. So the one friend used to live in El Paso and wanted to go and visit. So things. So I've been all over physically, so I can imagine pretty well when I get to see them 360 with an Oculus, etc. But St. Francis is kind of impressive. If you're curious, there's a neat movie about him. Brother, sun, sister, moon. This is one of those. Whoa. The whole thing is there? It looks like, doesn't it?
He came from a place where wealth was sacred. He lived in a time when war was known. War's a serious business. Yes, war is beautiful. And people speak badly of wars. Come on, sons of Assisi! God is with you! And in his innocence, he made a world where only truth was sacred, and only lust was holy. I seldom see